My daughter thought I was bluffing. That was her first mistake. The second was doing what she did at my grandson's gender reveal, in front of my entire family, with my wife standing 3 feet away holding a balloon she'd spent the whole morning blowing up herself. I should back up. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 54 years old. I have worked 31 years as a civil engineer in Sudbury, Ontario, and I have spent most of those years being exactly the kind of man my own father taught me to be. Patient, methodical, and slow to anger. My father used to say that a man who raises his voice has already lost the argument. I believed him when I was young. I still believe him now. But that belief has cost me things I did not know it would cost me. And the night my daughter-in-law put her hand on my wife's shoulder and said what she said, I understood that patience had a price, and I had been paying it for years without noticing the total. My son's name is Ben. He is 31. He married Ashlyn 3 years ago in a small ceremony in Muskoka. And, from the moment I met her, I will be honest with you, I tried. I genuinely tried. She was sharp and opinionated, and she had a way of looking at you when you spoke that made you feel like you were being evaluated for a position you hadn't applied for. But she was the woman my son loved, and that was enough for me. More than enough. My wife, Ruth, went out of her way. She texted Ashlyn recipes. She drove 2 hours to help them paint their first apartment in Toronto. She sent birthday cards every year with a handwritten note inside, because she believed in the kind of gestures that take time. Ashlyn never mentioned the cards. Not once, I noticed that. But I said nothing. The trouble started, properly started, I mean, about 18 months into the marriage. Ben had been quiet on our calls. Shorter than usual. He'd always been a talker, my son. Could spend an hour on the phone just telling you about a hockey game he'd seen on TV. But somewhere in that first year and a half, the calls got clipped. He started ending them with excuses. Said he was tired, said work was busy, said Ashlyn needed him for something. I did not push. I figured marriage was an adjustment. I remembered what it was like when Ruth and I were first starting out. How you fold your whole world into this one other person, and sometimes your parents feel very far away even when you love them. So I waited. What I did not know, because Ben would not tell me until much later, was that Ashlyn had started monitoring his calls. Not literally listening in, but timing them. Asking who he'd talk to, making comments if he seemed happy after speaking to us. She told him his family was negative. She said Ruth was controlling. She said I made him feel like he could never measure up. None of that was true. None of it. But Ben was in love. And when you are in love with someone who rewrites your history for you, it can take a long time before you recognize the new version as fiction. The gender reveal was Ashlyn's idea. It was May, a long weekend, the kind of clear Ontario spring day that makes you remember why you live here, despite everything the winters put you through. They'd rented a pavilion at a conservation area outside of Barrie. About 100 people, close family, a few of Ben's friends from university, Ashlyn's parents and her sister, and what seemed like the entire extended Whitmore network. The Whitmores were from money in a way that they made sure you knew about. Not flashy money, but the quieter kind. The kind that expresses itself through tasteful landscaping and very firm handshakes, and the assumption that their preferences were simply the correct preferences. Ashlyn's mother, Paulette Whitmore, had been pleasant enough to us at the wedding. The kind of pleasant that is really just the absence of open contempt. She called Ruth Hahn, in a way that made Ruth's jaw tighten slightly every time, though Ruth never said anything about it afterward. That was Ruth, too. She absorbed things quietly, and then she would process them alone at night, and I would lie next to her and feel the weight of what she was carrying, and she would not let me help. The pavilion was beautiful, I'll say that. String lights, a long buffet with catered food, an elaborate setup of blue and pink balloons at the far end that someone had clearly spent hours arranging. Ruth had arrived before me. She'd driven up early that morning to help, because of course she had. She'd brought a homemade bannock she'd made the night before, following a recipe she'd adapted from one her own mother used to make. She brought it in a cloth bag she'd sewn herself, and she set it on the food table with quiet pride, and then went to help Ashlyn's mother arrange the dessert spread, because she was that kind of woman. She did not know that Ashlyn had already told her own mother that Ruth was a bit much. I arrived with my brother Colm and his wife around noon. Ben met us at the gate. He looked happy, genuinely happy, the way he used to look at Christmas when he was 7, that unguarded brightness, and for a moment I thought, this is fine. This is going to be fine. The first 2 hours were fine. Ruth stayed busy the whole time. refilling things, talking to guests, laughing with Ben's friends who had always liked her because she was easy to like. I watched Ashlyn watch her from across the pavilion a couple of times, and I thought I was imagining the expression on her face. I told myself I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. Ben gave a short speech before they did the reveal. He thanked the caterer by name. He thanked the Whitmore family individually. Ashlyn's parents, her sister, her two aunts, her cousin who had driven from Mississauga. He thanked several of his friends from his years at Waterloo. And then at the end he said, "And of course thanks to my parents for making the drive." That was the line. Thanks for making the drive. Not my parents who have loved me my entire life. Not my mother who was here at 7 in the morning to help set up. Not my father who has never once in 31 years missed a single thing that mattered to this boy. Just, thanks for making the drive. The same thing you would say to a colleague who covered a late shift. I looked at Ruth when he said it. She had the smile fixed on her face, the one she wears when she is protecting someone from seeing how she actually feels. I knew that smile. I have been married to that woman for 33 years, and I know every version of every expression she makes, and that one breaks my heart every time. I did not say anything. Then they did the reveal. It was a boy, blue powder everywhere, Ben pumping his fist, Ashlyn laughing and crying at the same time, and for a few minutes it genuinely was beautiful and I let myself be in it. A grandson. I was going to have a grandson. I watched my son hold his wife, and I thought about the man I wanted that boy to grow up to become. And I put the rest of it away and just felt happy. That lasted until after the cake. I was standing by the food table, talking to my brother Colm, when I heard Ruth's voice from about 15 feet away. Not upset, not loud, just her normal voice. She had put her hand briefly on Ashlyn's arm, a small gesture, affectionate, and she was saying something about a name she liked for boys, a family name from her side, something she had probably mentioned to Ben 100 times over the years. A conversation. Just a conversation. Ashlyn stepped back. Not subtly. She stepped back the way you step back from something you don't want touching you. And then she said, not quietly, not privately, but at a volume that stopped 3 nearby conversations. She said, "I need you to stop hovering. You've been following me around all day and it's exhausting, and honestly, no one asked you to be here this early. No one asked you to bring food. This is my event. Can you please just give me space?" Ruth went very still. I was already walking toward them. And then Ashlyn put her hand on Ruth's shoulder. Not gently, not in apology, but in the firm pressing way you use to move someone. And she said, quietly enough that it was only the people closest to us who heard, but loud enough to be unmistakably deliberate. "Go stand with your husband. You're not needed over here." I reached them in about 4 steps. I put myself between my wife and this woman, and I looked Ashlyn in the eye, and I said nothing. Not because I had nothing to say. I had 30 years of careful, disciplined, methodical things to say. But I looked at my son, who had seen all of it, who had heard all of it, who was standing 8 feet away with his arms crossed, and he said nothing. He looked at the ground. He let his wife put her hands on his mother, and he looked at the ground. That was the moment. Not Ashlyn. Ashlyn was who she always had been. That moment with my son looking at the ground, that was the thing I had not been prepared for. I took Ruth's hand. I said, in a voice I kept completely level, "Get your things. We're going." Ruth started to say something to minimize it, to smooth it over, because that is what she does, and I said quietly, just to her, "We're going now." We said nothing to Ashlyn. We found Ben and I told him we were leaving, and I told him why, and I told him that when he was ready to have a real conversation, I would be there. He looked like he wanted to say something, he didn't. We left. We drove back to Sudbury in near silence. Ruth held her cloth bag in her lap the whole way, the one she'd brought the bannock in. At some point around Barry, I heard her exhale, slow and long, the kind you hold in until you're sure no one's watching. I didn't say anything. I just reached over and put my hand over hers on the bag, and she turned her hand over and held mine. The next 3 weeks were the quietest of the past several years of our lives. Ben called on the 4th day. I let it go to voicemail. He called again on the 6th, and I listened to the message, and he said he was sorry. Things had gotten tense, and that Ashlyn was under a lot of stress, and pregnancy was hard. He did not say. My wife put her hands on my mother. He did not say. I should have said something, he said tense, as if what had happened was a disagreement about the thermostat. I called him back the following day. I asked him one question. I said, "Did you see what happened?" He said yes. I said, "And you didn't say anything." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's complicated, Dad." I said, "No, it isn't." And I hung up. Ruth thought I was being too hard on him. She always does with Ben. She loves that boy with a completeness that has no room for self-protection. I love him the same way. But I had spent 31 years trying to raise him to be a certain kind of man, and the question of whether I had succeeded was no longer theoretical. What I didn't tell Ruth, what I didn't tell anyone, was that the same evening we drove back from Barrie, I had already begun making some quiet decisions. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vengeful person. I do not enjoy conflict. The decisions I made in the weeks after that day were not made in anger, at least, not by the time I made them. They were made in the same methodical way I make every important decision. Carefully, slowly, with full understanding of the consequences. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. My wife and I had a will. It had been updated 6 years ago, after my father passed and left me a property in northern Ontario. A piece of land on Lake Temagami that had been in my family for 3 generations. It wasn't worth a fortune in dollar terms, but it was worth everything in the terms that actually matter. I had always assumed it would pass to Ben. It was, I suppose, a given. The kind of assumption you don't examine because you think you don't need to. I examined it. I spent 2 hours on the phone with my lawyer going through the entire estate structure. By the end of that call, the Lake Temagami property was being separated into its own designation, held in a family trust with conditions attached. Ben could access it, but only if he and his spouse had maintained what the document described as a respectful and active relationship with both me and my wife. The language had to be careful, but the meaning was clear. The second thing I did was call my accountant. Ben was listed as a secondary account holder on a joint savings account, Ruth, and I had maintained for emergencies, a holdover from when he was in university. Nothing enormous, around $40,000, but it was there, and his name was on it. I had his name removed. Not to punish him. To clarify, that account existed for Ruth and me, and the relationship required to justify his access to it had changed. The third thing I did was nothing. I waited. I have found in 54 years that doing nothing is the most misunderstood form of action. People assume stillness is passivity. It isn't. Stillness is how you let the situation reveal itself fully before you respond. I had made my adjustments quietly and legally and completely. Now I waited to see what the situation would reveal. What it revealed, over the following months, surprised me. Ben started calling more. Not in the careful, Ashlyn is monitoring. This way he had called for the past 18 months, but in the older way, the rambling, 45-minute way, about nothing in particular. He called to tell me about a hockey game. He called to ask my opinion on a car he was thinking about buying. He called once just to tell me that he and a friend had tried a new barbecue place near their apartment, and it reminded him of the ribs I used to make on the deck in the summers when he was in high school. I received those calls. I was present for them. But I did not pretend the conversation in Barrie had not happened, and I did not make it easy. About 6 weeks after the gender reveal, Ashlyn called Ruth directly. Ruth told me about it that evening, carefully, the way she tells me things she is unsure how I'll receive. Ashlyn had called to apologize. Ruth said the apology sounded genuine. Stilted, maybe rehearsed, but genuine underneath. Ashlyn said she had been overwhelmed and scared and that she had taken it out on the wrong person. She did not ask for anything, she just apologized. Ruth cried a little on the phone. She told Ashlyn she accepted it. I was glad Ruth had that. Whatever was happening between Ashlyn and me, whatever had been broken in the trust I was supposed to have in my son's choices, Ruth deserved that apology and she deserved to accept it on her own terms. That was hers. I didn't interfere with it. Ben called me 2 weeks after that, late on a Sunday evening. He asked if I would come to Toronto for a weekend. He said he wanted to take me to dinner. Just us. I went. We went to a place he'd found in the west end of the city. Good food, quiet enough to talk, and he did something I had not expected. He started from the beginning. He told me about the 18 months before the gender reveal. He told me about the conversations with Ashlyn, the way she'd framed things, the way he'd believed her, because he'd wanted to believe her. He told me that the night we drove away from Barrie, he had stood in that pavilion and looked at the place where we had been and understood. For the first time, something he hadn't been able to see while it was happening. He said, I let her talk me into thinking you and Mom were the problem. And I knew, somewhere, I knew it wasn't true. I didn't want to fight about it, and that's not an excuse. I listened to all of it, then I said, the night it happened, why didn't you say something? He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, and then he said, I was afraid of her reaction, in public. I was afraid of what she'd do. That sentence cost him something to say. I could see it cost him something, and I understood it more than I let on, because I remembered being young and being in love, and how that love can become a kind of trap you've built for yourself, and can't see clearly from the inside. I said, "You're going to be a father in 6 weeks," he said. "I know," I said. "What kind of man do you want your son to watch you become?" He didn't answer that night. I didn't expect him to. Some questions aren't meant to be answered immediately. They're meant to be carried. We finished dinner. I paid. He hugged me in the parking lot longer than he had hugged me in years, and I let him. And for a moment, he was just my boy again. I drove back to Sudbury the next morning. Ruth was at the kitchen table when I came in, tea in hand, and she looked at me with that expression she has where she is reading something in my face that I have not yet said out loud. "How was it?" she asked. I sat down across from her. I told her everything he had said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Do you believe him?" I thought about it carefully. I said, "I believe he believes it." She nodded. That was the right answer for both of us. Ashlyn had their son 8 weeks later. He was healthy, 7 pounds 4 ounces, born on a Tuesday morning at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. Ben texted me a photo within the first hour. Ashlyn holding the baby, exhausted and luminous the way women are in that first hour, and Ben beside her looking like a man who has just seen the face of something larger than himself. I looked at that photo for a long time, Ruth cried. I did not cry, but I sat with something I couldn't name for a while. Something between relief and the particular grief of loving people, across distances you didn't choose. They named him Oliver. After no one in particular, Ben said. Just a name they both loved. 2 weeks after Oliver was born, I drove to Toronto with Ruth. We did not announce it dramatically. We just went. We brought food. Ruth made a big pot of soup, and I brought supplies for the meals I knew they'd be too tired to think about. Ashlyn answered the door, with Oliver in her arms, and she looked at us and she said, simply, "Thank you for coming." She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been through something enormous, and was only beginning to understand the size of it. I looked at my grandson for the first time, and he looked back at me with the unfocused, ancient gaze that newborns have, and I thought about my father, and his father, and all the things that get passed down, without anyone choosing to pass them down. Ruth took Oliver from Ashlyn with the practiced ease of a woman who has known what to do with a baby since before she can remember, and Ashlyn watched her, and something in Ashlyn's face shifted. Not dramatically, just shifted, like something that had been held at tension finally released. We stayed 4 days. I cooked. Ruth held Oliver for hours while Ashlyn slept. Ben and I fixed a shelf that had been coming off the wall since they moved in. We didn't talk about Barry, we didn't need to. On the last evening before we drove back, I was in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when Ashlyn came in. Just the two of us. She leaned against the counter and watched me for a moment, and then she said, "I know you didn't have to come." I said, "Oliver is my grandson," she said. "That's not what I mean." I turned off the tap and looked at her. She looked like she wanted to say something that she hadn't rehearsed and didn't know how to get out. I said, "It's all right." She said, "It's not." I said, "No, but it can be." She nodded. She didn't cry. I respected her more for that. A few months after we got back, my lawyer sent the updated estate documents to be stored on file. The trust language remained. The conditions remained. Not because I was still angry. I wasn't, or not in the way I had been, but because some things, once clarified, should stay clarified. It had nothing to do with Ashlyn anymore. It had to do with what I believed about the relationships that should earn things, and the things that should not simply be assumed. Ben found out about the trust language later. I told him myself, directly, on a Sunday call in October. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he understood why I'd done it. He didn't ask me to change it. That told me more about who he was becoming than anything else he could have said. Oliver is 4 months old now. Last weekend, Ruth and I drove down again, and we sat on the floor of their living room and watched this small person figure out that his own hands belonged to him. And Ben sat next to me on the floor, and we watched together, and it was the kind of quiet that feels like something recovered rather than something lost. I am not a man who believes in winning. I don't think what happened to my family over these past years was a game. And I don't think the choices I made were weapons. I made them because I believed, I still believe, that the relationships that matter most should be tended carefully, and that when they are broken, the repair has to be real. My father used to say that the people who love you will sometimes fail you, and the question is not whether they fail you, but what they do next. Ben is figuring out what he does next. Ashlyn is too, in her own way, and I suppose I am as well, figuring out how to hold what happened with enough honesty to remember it, and enough grace not to let it be the only thing left. Oliver doesn't know any of this yet. He's 4 months old, and he knows his mother's voice and the warmth of being held and the faces that appear above him when he wakes up. When he is older, I hope he knows a family that chose each other again, after things got hard. That's the only inheritance that actually matters.